Jeffrey Epstein did not look like the man who would become the center of one of modern history's most disturbing scandals. He wasn't a celebrity. He didn't build a famous company. He almost never gave interviews. Yet, for decades, Epstein moved silently among the most powerful people on the planet: presidents, royalty, billionaires, and world-renowned scientists. His story isn't just about crime. It's about power, access, and what happens when influence completely eclipses accountability. So, who was this man? Let's go back to the beginning. Jeffrey Epstein was born in 1953 in Brooklyn, New York, to a middle-class family. His father worked for the city parks department, and by all accounts, his childhood was pretty ordinary. He was smart, especially with numbers, and showed academic promise early on. But here's the first strange twist. After a brief stint in college, Epstein never actually got a degree. This fact alone makes his later career path baffling. How does a college dropout enter the most elite circles in the world? In the early 1970s, despite having no formal teaching credentials or a college degree, Epstein landed a job teaching mathematics at the prestigious Dalton School in Manhattan. Dalton was, and still is, a school for the children of New York's wealthiest and most influential families. The exact story of how he got that job has never been fully explained. What is clear is that this position put him directly in the orbit of privilege, money, and powerful social networks. It was here that he began building the connections that would define his life. After leaving Dalton under mysterious circumstances, he pivoted to the world of finance, landing a job at the major investment bank, Bear Stearns. Again, his rise was meteoric and confusing. He wasn't known for any major public investment wins, yet his personal wealth seemed to explode. By the 1990s, Epstein was calling himself a billionaire financier, claiming he managed money exclusively for a handful of ultra-wealthy clients. But unlike other Wall Street giants, Epstein had no transparent track record, no visible fund, no clear verifiable source for his immense fortune. Journalists, and even some of his own associates, later admitted they could never figure out how he actually made his money. So what did Epstein invest in? Image and access. He bought a massive mansion in Manhattan, an estate in Palm Beach, homes in Paris and New Mexico, and eventually, a private island in the US Virgin Islands, which would later become infamous. He flew on private jets and surrounded himself with all the symbols of sophistication and power: fine art, scientific philanthropy, and elite social gatherings. He carefully crafted an image of himself as a well-connected intellectual. He donated to scientific research, hobnobbed with academics, and presented himself as a patron of progress. This persona was his armor. It made people less likely to ask hard questions. In the exclusive circles he moved in, Epstein was often described as eccentric or private, but rarely as suspicious. But even then, behind this polished exterior, the warning signs were there. Quiet stories circulated. Staff members came and went with alarming frequency. Young women were seen constantly at his properties. For years, these signs were ignored, minimized, or dismissed entirely. In environments where wealth and influence are the ultimate currency, uncomfortable truths are often rationalized away. No one wanted to be the one to rock the boat. One of the most crucial elements of Epstein's rise was his ability to make himself useful to powerful people. He was a master networker. He connected individuals, opened doors, and created opportunities that others couldn't. In return, he gained a form of protection. This wasn't necessarily a grand conspiracy, but something more subtle: social inertia. The thinking went like this: if he's welcome at all these important places, someone else must have already vetted him. That single assumption would prove to be devastatingly wrong. By the early 2000s, law enforcement had received serious, credible allegations against Epstein. Yet even then, the public knew almost nothing. His name was virtually unknown outside of those elite circles, and that anonymity was a key part of his shield. He wasn't famous enough to attract widespread media scrutiny, but he was powerful enough to deflect the scrutiny that did come his way. To understand who Jeffrey Epstein was, you have to understand that he wasn't an obvious, cartoonish villain. He was quiet, strategic, and deeply embedded in systems that value status far more than transparency. His story forces us to ask a difficult question: how many warning signs can be ignored when the right people benefit from silence? And that is where the real mystery begins, not just with his horrifying crimes, but with how he was allowed to operate, unchecked, in plain sight, for so very long. Thanks for watching. If you found this story compelling, be sure to follow for more deep dives into the stories that shape our world. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Epstein wasn't just another wealthy man living a life of luxury. He had become a connector, a gatekeeper, someone who moved effortlessly between worlds that rarely intersect. Finance, politics, science, royalty, and entertainment, all of them, seemed to orbit around him at one time or another. To truly understand Epstein's power, you have to understand how influence works when money can open literally every door. Think about it. Former presidents, global business leaders, Nobel Prize-winning scientists, and even members of royal families, all of them, at various times, appeared in photographs, on guest lists, or on flight logs connected to Epstein. Now, many of these relationships were purely social, some were professional, and others were just ambiguous. But when you put them all together, they created a powerful story. The narrative became, Jeffrey Epstein must be legitimate, because all these powerful people trust him, and that perception, that feeling, ended up mattering more than any hard facts. Epstein was a master of cultivating exclusivity. He claimed he only managed money for a tiny, select group of ultra-wealthy clients. This reinforced the idea that his work was too elite, too complex for outsiders to possibly understand. There were no public prospectuses, no standard financial disclosures, and no clear investment strategy you could point to. In the world of traditional finance, this total lack of transparency would be a massive red flag. But in Epstein's world, it just added to his mystique. His Manhattan mansion, one of the largest private residences in New York City, hosted these incredible dinners. You'd have politicians, top academics, and powerful financiers all in the same room, mingling. His estate in Palm Beach was a magnet for the wealthy seasonal crowd. And then there was his private island, a place that offered total isolation, luxury, and most importantly, discretion. Epstein understood something fundamental about human nature. Access creates obligation. When you invite people into these exclusive, almost secret environments, they feel special, they feel chosen, and that feeling often leads to gratitude and loyalty, even if it's subconscious. Epstein was constantly introducing people to each other, facilitating donations to their favorite causes, funding their research projects. Over time, this created a complex web of soft influence. Favors were owed, introductions were remembered, and a lot of uncomfortable feelings were simply ignored. And money amplified everything. Epstein donated millions upon millions of dollars to universities, research institutions, and political campaigns. These donations bought him credibility, and, whether intentionally or not, they bought him silence. Institutions rarely ask tough questions about their benefactors, especially when the money comes in quietly, without any public controversy. So, Epstein's philanthropy acted like a reputational shield. It signaled respectability and diverted attention away from his personal conduct. Perhaps the most troubling part of all this is how this influence machine interacted with law enforcement and the justice system. When the first allegations against him started to surface, Epstein's network proved incredibly effective. He had high-powered attorneys, political connections, and the ability to make things happen behind the scenes. These weren't necessarily cases of simple bribery. It was about having access to the decision-makers. It was the confidence that comes from knowing the system often favors those who know how to navigate it from the inside. Epstein's connections also had a chilling effect, discouraging victims from ever speaking out. Imagine being a young person facing someone with virtually unlimited resources and a Rolodex full of the most powerful people in the world. The imbalance of power was just overwhelming. Many victims later said they believed no one would ever listen to them, or worse, they feared that speaking up would put them in even more danger. In this way, Epstein's influence wasn't just social, it was a form of psychological control. Now, it's crucial to state that not everyone connected to Epstein was complicit in his crimes. Some of these associations were brief, some were superficial, and many were based on incomplete or misleading information. However, the broader pattern is undeniable. Epstein consistently surrounded himself with people whose reputations acted as a shield for his own. When questions were raised, his defenders would point to his guest lists, rather than addressing the actual allegations. The presence of respected figures creates doubt. That doubt delays action, and that delay allows harm to continue unchecked. By the time real, serious scrutiny finally caught up with him, Epstein's empire of influence had already done its work for years. His money bought him time, his connections bought him silence, and his status bought him disbelief from the people who should have been asking questions. He wasn't completely untouchable, but he was protected for long enough for the damage to multiply over and over again. Understanding Epstein's power forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The very systems we build on trust, on prestige, and on influence can be manipulated by those who understand them best. Epstein didn't have to break into elite spaces. He was welcomed in with open arms, and once he was inside, he figured out exactly how to make himself indispensable. The question that still lingers isn't just who knew what was happening. It's about why so many of our systems in finance, in media, in law, in academia fail to ask the hard questions much sooner. Thanks for watching. If you found this exploration of power and influence insightful, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into complex topics. At the heart of the Epstein case, it's easy to get lost in the headlines about private jets, sprawling mansions, and the network of famous and powerful names. But the real story, the one that truly matters, isn't about any of that. It's about the victims. For years their voices were silenced, their stories dismissed, and their pain buried under layers of influence and disbelief. To understand what truly happened, we have to look past the sensational details and see the chillingly consistent pattern that unfolded over decades, across multiple locations, and through countless testimonies. Epstein's actions were never random. They were part of a deliberate, repeatable system, a meticulously crafted machine built on vulnerability, manipulation, and control. Survivors and investigators have pieced together a playbook that he used again and again. The primary targets were often young, financially insecure, and socially isolated individuals. They were approached with offers that seemed too good to be true, yet harmless on the surface. A job as a personal assistant, a chance to earn money through tutoring, or appointments for massage work. These were framed as opportunities, not threats. This recruitment strategy was crucial. By avoiding overt force from the very beginning, Epstein lowered suspicion. He created a situation where his targets felt like they were making a choice, that they were willingly walking into his world, even if they had no idea what that world truly entailed. This psychological gray area was a powerful weapon. It planted seeds of confusion and guilt, complex emotions that made it incredibly difficult for them to speak out later. They would ask themselves, did I choose this? Was it my fault? That self-doubt was a cornerstone of his control. Once someone was drawn into his orbit, the boundaries began to shift, slowly at first, then all at once. Survivors have described a process of gradual normalization. Expectations would change, rules would be rewritten on the fly, and what was once uncomfortable became the new standard. If anyone resisted, the response was rarely outright violence. Instead, he applied pressure. He would remind them of the money they were earning, the favors he had done for them, or the dire consequences of disappointing someone so powerful. It was control exercised through a suffocating imbalance of power, not through overt threats. It made them feel trapped, not by force, but by obligation and fear. Another critical element of this system was isolation. Epstein's properties were more than just luxurious homes. They were fortresses designed to sever individuals from their support systems. The sheer size of the estates, the restricted access areas, and the layers of staff created an environment where victims felt constantly watched but never protected. They were surrounded by people, yet completely alone. Some were told they were the only one, a special confidant. Others would later learn, to their horror, that countless others had been brought through the exact same rooms, under nearly identical pretenses. This isolation magnified their sense of helplessness. Fear was the engine that kept the entire operation running. Epstein's immense wealth and powerful connections weren't just abstract concepts. They were tools he actively wielded. He made sure his victims knew about his influence, his relationships with world leaders and celebrities, and his seemingly limitless resources. The message, whether spoken or implied, was terrifyingly simple. He was untouchable, and they were not. This fear was brutally reinforced whenever early reports or complaints went nowhere. In some cases, victims did find the courage to speak up to their families, to local authorities, or to school officials. But when nothing happened, when their pleas were met with inaction or disbelief, silence became a survival strategy. Being ignored can be just as damaging as a direct threat. It teaches you that resistance is pointless. We also have to talk about shame. The shame victims felt was not an accidental byproduct of his abuse. It was a deliberately cultivated tool. He relied on them internalizing the blame, believing that no one would ever believe them, or that they would be judged and ostracized if they told their story. This psychological weight was a key part of his system. The more isolated and ashamed a person felt, the less likely they were to challenge a man who seemed to have the entire world in his pocket. The geographical patterns are also impossible to ignore. Allegations consistently surfaced in New York, Florida, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, all locations directly tied to Epstein's properties. The remarkable consistency of the stories coming from these disparate places undermined any claim that these were just misunderstandings or isolated incidents. Instead, they painted a picture of a highly structured, long-term operation. It wasn't a series of mistakes, it was a business model. When journalists and investigators finally started connecting these dots, the sheer scale of it all became undeniable. Survivors who had never met, who lived in different states and came from different backgrounds, described nearly identical experiences. They detailed the same recruitment methods, the same physical settings, the same manipulative language, and the same devastating outcomes. It was these parallels that transformed individual stories of trauma into a mountain of collective evidence that could no longer be ignored. One of the most painful truths of this case is how long it took for this pattern to be publicly acknowledged. Many victims waited years, some for decades, before they saw their experiences validated. Justice delayed isn't just a failure to punish the guilty. It's an act that prolongs and compounds the harm done to the innocent. Every day that passed was another day they had to live with the world, telling them their truth didn't matter. Ultimately, the Epstein case exposed profound and systemic failures within our society. It showed how institutions that are supposed to protect the vulnerable, law enforcement, the justice system, the media, often deferred to wealth, power, and reputation. Credibility was too often assigned based on a person's status, not the truth of their words. This created a hierarchy of belief, where the voices of the powerful consistently drowned out the pleas of the powerless. When the survivors finally began to be heard, their courage fundamentally reshaped the narrative. The story was no longer about a mysterious financier or a shadowy cabal of elites. It became about accountability. It became about finally listening to those who had been systematically ignored, and about recognizing that silence, in the face of such evil, is a form of complicity. The stories of the victims reveal the most uncomfortable truth of all. Jeffrey Epstein's power did not exist in a vacuum. It was enabled and sustained by disbelief, by delay, and by a system that repeatedly chose the comfort of looking away over the difficult confrontation with the truth. Their voices, full of pain but also incredible strength, forced the world to look closer, and once we did, we could no longer look away. If you or anyone you know has been a victim of abuse, please know that you are not alone and help is available. You can contact the National Sexual Assault Hotline or other local support services. Your voice deserves to be heard. Thank you for watching. By the mid-2000s, the wall of silence around Jeffrey Epstein finally started to show cracks. Complaints that had once been dismissed or ignored began to pile up, painting a picture that law enforcement could no longer easily look away from. What should have been a moment of accountability turned into one of the most controversial legal outcomes in modern American history. The first major investigation started in Palm Beach, Florida. Local police began receiving reports from multiple young women, all describing similar encounters connected to Epstein's estate. Detectives quickly saw a clear pattern: the same locations, the same methods, and the same descriptions of Epstein's behavior. This wasn't just a single allegation anymore. It was a systemic operation. The Palm Beach police launched an extensive investigation, interviewing dozens of witnesses and compiling a detailed report. The evidence was so substantial that the local police chief later stated publicly his department believed serious crimes had been committed. The case was then handed over to prosecutors with the expectation that Epstein would face significant charges. But at this point, everything changed. As the case moved from local authorities to federal prosecutors, Epstein assembled a legal dream team that few could ever afford. High-profile attorneys with deep political connections got involved, engaging directly with federal officials behind closed doors. What happened next wasn't a public trial, but a series of secret negotiations. In 2008, the outcome stunned everyone, from the investigators to the victims. Epstein struck a plea agreement that allowed him to avoid federal prosecution entirely. Instead of facing a long prison sentence, he pleaded guilty in a Florida state court to much lesser charges. The deal was shockingly lenient. Epstein served a short sentence with extensive work release privileges, allowing him to leave custody for most of the day, every day. Perhaps the most troubling part of the agreement was a provision that granted immunity from federal prosecution, not just to Epstein, but also to unnamed associates. This clause immediately raised alarm bells. Who else was being protected, and why? The victims were kept completely in the dark. Many of them only learned about the deal after it was already finalized. This was a clear violation of victims' rights laws, which require notification and an opportunity to be heard. For those who had risked so much to come forward, the message was devastating. The system had negotiated around them, not for them. Publicly, the deal was presented as a resolution, but behind the scenes, legal experts, journalists, and former prosecutors heavily criticized it. The disparity between this outcome and other cases with far less evidence was impossible to ignore. It seemed that wealth and influence had once again rewritten the rules of justice. This plea agreement effectively shut down any further investigation for years. Epstein returned to his lavish properties, his lifestyle largely unchanged. While he had to register as a sex offender, the consequences were a slap on the wrist compared to the scope of the allegations against him. Internally, frustration was boiling over. Law enforcement officers who had poured their energy into the case expressed pure anger and disbelief. Some later said their work had been completely undermined at the highest levels. The message was clear: some defendants operate under a different set of rules. The deal also had a chilling effect on other potential victims. Seeing such a powerful man avoid serious consequences reinforced their deepest fears that coming forward was pointless, or even dangerous. Silence, once again, felt safer than seeking justice. For nearly a decade, the Epstein case faded from public view. He was a convicted offender, but not a public villain. The agreement had done exactly what it was designed to do: contain the damage and make the problem go away. But the story didn't end there. Years later, as journalists began digging back into the case, the shocking details of that plea agreement started to resurface. Investigative reporting exposed just how unusual the deal truly was, and how aggressively it had been negotiated behind the scenes. Public outrage exploded. The narrative shifted from just being about Epstein to the entire system that had enabled him. The 2008 agreement would eventually be called a catastrophic failure of justice, not just because of its lenient outcome, but because of what it revealed about our institutions. It showed how the legal system can be bent through access, pressure, and discretion, often without leaving any fingerprints. This first investigation should have stopped Jeffrey Epstein in his tracks. Instead, it became the very reason his activities were allowed to continue unchecked for so many more years. The deal that shocked the world did more than spare one man. It exposed how power can hollow out accountability from the inside. And when the case finally reopened years later, the fallout would be far louder, far more public, and absolutely impossible to contain. Thanks for watching. If you found this video informative, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into complex stories like this one. See you next time.